And yes, I was reminded earlier just how old and how long I've been about when Penny Lewis spoke about the Law Commission, because it reminded me that when I went up to UCL in 1966 as first year undergraduate, all the talk amongst the lecturers and the tutors was the exciting new world that was coming in, the 1965 Act that established the Law Commission, the brainchild of Lord Gardner, who was the Labour Lord Chancellor, passionate in his cause of law reform, and with his confident belief that a law commission would modernise the law and simplify it in a way that made it readily accessible to ordinary people, and much less need for lawyers in society. Now, we could reflect on that for a long time, and Penny might want to think she's had a lot of success, but how far have they achieved that laudable objective? So much for reminiscing. The paper that I have put out is intended to identify what I see as the most significant changes in the organisation, governance and culture within the criminal justice system over those past 50 years. And I've tried to identify some trends, particularly from the practitioner's perspective, and explore how they've impacted on the working and the perception of the key institutions. I focus on centralisation and look in particular at the way there has been development towards centralisation in the courts, the prosecution arrangements, probation, and the police. And I regard it as important because those changes have the potential for unseen consequences, including political administrative blocks to reform of certain key issues, blocks that might not otherwise have existed and not in the same way. But it goes further, because I think the CJS system is now managed through a structure which is heavily dominated by the main agencies. Each has its own agenda, and collectively with the capacity to skew the system in terms of fairness and outcomes. And the dependency on central funding can be both a driver for change and an inhibitor, since justice becomes less local and access becomes more difficult, both financially and geographically. So in sketching some of those trends, I've been concerned with the big picture of criminal justice evolution, and where we have moved from what was undoubtedly fragmentation to unified structures in the CJS. We do have to ask whether we've built ineffective impersonal monoliths divorced from local communities and each remote from each other in place of that fragmentation, and how far has that organizational change contributed, with or without other factors, to the sense of crisis and apparent lack of confidence in the CJS which is around us at the moment. And rather than conclusions, I shall actually finish this presentation with 3 questions that I will leave people to ponder on. Looking across those key institutions, looking at the clock as well, which you'll all be wanting your suppers soon. When I was called to the bar in 1969, Hodgepodge was the order of the day. Dr. Beeching, famed for his railway acts, was at work in the higher courts, and the 2-tier system based on assizes, quarter sessions, was about to move on. And Bedfordshire, where I grew up, we had 3 courts, the assizes, the borough quarter sessions, and the county quarter sessions. It certainly needed reform, and the Crown Court unified the structure and initially built on local arrangements. The trouble is that central government tends to be less sensitive to local concerns and needs. And for example, Bedfordshire is now one of those counties which has no longer a higher court, and I'm not sure that it even has a magistrates court anymore. And Milton Keynes, for example, a big new city, does not have a Crown Court. It's by no means unique, and the outcomes are really quite clear, I think, in terms of how we have failed to have sufficient courtrooms and sitting days available to meet the workload. So the courts are now run separately by the Courts and Tribunal Service, but nonetheless, I think critics would point to the vice-like grip of the Treasury on the budget of the court service as a major factor. So that's one area of centralisation. Magistrates' courts reflect a similar picture, transition from probably too many local benches and magistrates' courts committees, overseen then at arm's length by the Home Office, through a series of arranged or shotgun marriages and mergers, and they were whittled down. They were moved from the responsibility of the Home Secretary to the Lord Chancellor, and then some central management came in through the court service. Then it was merged with the courts and tribunal service, and there's no longer any local input into management. Local justice effectively disappeared with the amalgamation of court areas. And indeed, the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, now before Parliament, actually goes so far as to abolish local justice areas completely. And that will be a major change. Buckinghamshire has one magistrates' court served by one bench of magistrates, and I think we have to accept that there is no effective input by the local magistracy anymore into the management of the organisations. We've seen lay magistrates diminish in number from some 30,000 when Sir Robin Auld delivered his review of the courts, down to, that was in 2001, down to 14,348 as at the 1st of April 2019. That is a dramatic decrease, and I know from my own experience within government that for a long time there have been very many officials who would actually like to see the demise of the lay magistracy completely. The number of courts has diminished from substantially between 2010 and 2019. 323 courts were shut. 162 of the 323 courts were shut, which is a loss of 50% of the estate. And as recently as June, practitioners were describing the magistrates' courts as fairness has been sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. So query the values of centralisation. The CPS is a very interesting case study. It was the recommendation of the Phillips Royal Commission, but a very interesting quote, because their recommendation was for a locally based organisation with central features. And a very interesting quote, we believe it to be hazardous to argue from the experience of other jurisdictions that a national prosecution service would be workable in England and Wales. We know of no common law jurisdiction in which the equivalent of a national prosecution system of the type we're discussing covers an area with anything approaching the population of England and Wales, although some are geographically much larger, or deals with a crime load of anything like that of the same order of magnitude. Despite that warning, the government did go ahead and opt for a national system. And the official history of the CPS by Professor Paul Rock attributes that to, in part, to fear of local influence on justice issues, and also the natural centralising tendency of government and parliament. In fact, the system didn't survive long, and it's undergone umpteen reorganisations, first down to 13 areas, back up under the Labour government to 42 areas, and then gradually amalgamations, so that CPS offices are few and far between. The probation service, another interesting case study, formed in 1907 through a set of area-based services interacting at arm's length with the central government. It became a national probation service, came into being in 2001, and since then it's been three major upheavals. The Offender Management Act 2007 sought to integrate prison and probation services. It then became part of the Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, transferred to the Ministry of Justice from the Home Office, and they set up 42 probation areas. Subsequently, it was split between the private and the public sector, and now it is, that was the Grayling reforms in 2014, and now it is being moved back again. And the jury is still out. As the new chief inspector of probation said earlier this year, there are no magic bullets here. Structural change needs to be backed by sustained investment for there to be true improvement. Real transformation is a long-term commitment, and unification is just the beginning of that journey. So we haven't exactly had a lot of benefits yet to the system, although logically an efficient central system ought to work. Policing the change has been more subtle. The number of forces has changed little since 1974. There was an attempt to force mergers in 2006, 2007 without resort to Parliament, and that was unsuccessful. But there have been a lot of changes of governance which have steadily strengthened the central influence. So the pattern is the same across the across all of the major criminal justice institutions, creeping centralization and a stronger hand from the centre. They are profound changes, and they have implications not only for how each of the agencies operates individually, but also how they interact with each other and how this impacts on the working of the criminal justice system as a whole. Because quite often those changes were undertaken by criminal justice departments on a unilateral basis with little consultation and little regard to actually aligning the organisation structurally with the other parts of the system. And in a moment, I will give you an excellent quote from Sir Robin Auld, which I think summarises what he was finding about the criminal justice system, or lack of system, as many would have put it. So that's the direct organisational issues. There were other indirect consequences of those changes, as well as some external factors, such as austerity and rising crime figures. Those last two, austerity and crime figures, cannot be attributed to centralisation, but what centralisation did was create a much more centralised political response to a lot of issues. Tony Blair's street crime initiative, for example, that was something which would not have been possible on a localised system. But of course, it was highly political, and whilst it was merited, it was a raw delivery of a political target, and often to the exclusion of other important priorities in the criminal justice system. So it's one of the factors that I think the centralisation has facilitated much greater political involvement. The role of central departments has changed with centralisation. They've morphed from one of policy making with policy to be implemented locally to one where the quality of implementation, they've morphed from one of being policy made centrally implemented locally and then scrutinised by inspectorates to one where the central departments both develop and implement policy. There's been a knock-on effect to inspectorates, and in particular their relationship with ministers. And I speak from experience. It's one thing to report objectively on a local service for which a minister does not have direct accountability. It's another thing to report that the performance delivered by a minister's own department is below standard. The messenger is often in danger of being shot. Ministers have increasingly been drawn, in my view and experience, into routine operational issues. And the creation of executive agencies was perceived as a means of distancing departments from operational matters, but they never really achieved that. Whatever the theory, ministers find it very difficult in practice to stand back from the operational, and the instinct of politicians to intervene in high-profile or controversial issues, whether to take the credit or promise a solution, is very high. Inexorably, expectations are raised and they get further sucked in, and it becomes a vicious circle. And recently, the Colin Pitchford case relating to the parole board, a man who had served a very long time, way beyond the required sentence, had been found to be safe, a proper process, and it was simply a popular outcry that caused the Ministry of Justice to try and refer that back again. Rising crime rates have been a driver for change. We've heard earlier about the creation following Runciman of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and indeed Runciman was established as a response to serious miscarriage of justice, but it actually changed during its life and became one focused equally, if not more, on impediments to successful prosecutions, and that was later described as a rebalancing. I think Sir Robin Auld perhaps offers some of the best insights into the changes, and he was commissioned in December 1999 to produce a wide-ranging review of the criminal courts, and he reported in October 2001. And I promised you a quote earlier as to what he actually found, and he described it as no system worthy of the name, and had this to say: each of the departments and of the various agencies has aims, policies and budgets broadly directed to the common end of reducing crime and the fair and efficient administration of criminal justice, but which in their application often conflict. These operational conflicts are interdepartmental and interagency, but they also occur within different managerial or geographical divisions of the same department or agency. They are no doubt the stuff of any large organization or group of organizations, different parts of which endeavor to contribute in their own ways to a common end. Human nature is such that departmental loyalties engender sectional interests and sometimes mutual distrust. But where they arise in the administration of criminal justice, sharpened by firm budgetary and spending constraints, they can cause much harm, including injustice, distress, expense and inconvenience to defendants, witnesses, victims, jurors, legal practitioners and others involved in the process, and much inefficiency and wastefulness in the system as a whole. And I think that experience shows that that is very much a comment that would apply today. What Robin Auld did was to look then at what he regarded as the drivers, the key drivers in the criminal justice system, and he identified two in particular: public expectations and politics. He recognized that clearly the system had to be responsive to public concerns, but the caution that he administered was that it should not be regarded as a medium for curing the ills of society. And of course, that is an area where we are not good at managing the expectations as to what the criminal justice system can achieve in dealing with many of those ills around drugs and many other situations. As to politics, he commented again that one had to recognize how naive it would be to suggest that politics should be removed from the forces driving change. But he also pointed and he recognized the legitimate interest in forming criminal justice policy on the part of politicians and in the legislation for implementing. But in effect, he gave a very considered warning against sort of knee-jerk legislation. And I could summarize his quote as saying simply, "Stop making policy on the back of envelopes." And that actually came in 2001. And it was not long after that that the criminal justice system woke up from one morning to find the announcement from Number 10 that the post of the Lord Chancellor was to be abolished with immediate effect. There was in effect an immediate backtracking because the lawyers pointed out to Number 10 that it left nobody to exercise the literally hundreds of powers vested in that office holder whose position was being abolished overnight. So I think you have the clear thrust of my thinking that whatever potential benefits there have been in centralization, we have not reaped those benefits, and we need to look very closely at the drivers, and indeed whether the process has gone too far. I can't avoid a word about, of course, technology in all of this. Because in examining these drivers, one's got to recognize that technological advances of recent decades have contributed a lot in positive terms. It's easier to develop and implement digital systems in centralized organizations, and the demands of technology can drive standardization. What is less clear to my mind is that standard casework management systems, which operate both in the courts, prosecutions, and elsewhere, actually benefit the quality of casework and facilitate better and more just outcomes. One size does not fit all, and a frequent outcome of case management systems in any organization may be that cases are owned by everyone and nobody, and that is how cases drift and do not get the individual attention that they need. I promised, instead of a conclusion, the 3 or 4 questions which I will leave you with, subject to one overarching comment. The questions that I pose: has the degree of centralization within the agencies achieved greater efficiency and effectiveness within those agencies individually? Has the degree of centralization enabled greater efficiency and effectiveness across the criminal justice system as a whole? Is it practical to run the criminal justice system as a single entity? The Phillips Royal Commission balked at the feasibility of running an independent prosecution service as a national organisation, and the subsequent history has demonstrated just how difficult that task is. So logic suggests that running an entire criminal justice system as a national organisation would be even more problematic. Finally, do the governance arrangements properly balance the competing interests of the different CJS stakeholders? And there one looks towards the central mechanisms, which are very, very heavily populated by the senior officials, the heads, ministers of the central agencies, and often there is not a great representation of the professional and other interests that would bring objectivity. My final overarching comment is to ask the question as to whether there is a halfway house, because there's a lot of the topics in the criminal justice system that do need to be addressed at national level, whether it's in policing, prosecutions, and so forth. You have the National Crime Agency as a first step along that line, and whether we ought to be looking more at a 2-tier system where the top level of crime is investigated, prosecuted, and dealt with at one level, and the more local matters are dealt with by more locally structured organizations. So that is a thought as you pose those as you look at those 4 questions that I've just posed.